Hi, and welcome to week 8, where we are going to explore chapter 6 on groups. So, chapter 6 introduces you to this concept of social groups, which is very different in a sociological framework than just the way that we tend to talk about groups. It's really important that social groups have some sort of shared identity as well as regular interaction. So, while we might say, yeah, I got off the metro and I was with a group of people, that actually doesn't apply to a sociological definition of a social group. Rather, that would be considered an aggregate. But groups like the classmates or anyone in an exercise class we're in, our neighbors, our family members are all considered to be part of our groups. Now, there's two main groups that your book talks about, and I just want to quickly highlight their importance: primary groups and secondary groups. Now, primary groups are oftentimes one of the first social groups that we experience in our lives. They often involve more face-to-face interaction, a greater sense of cooperation, and also pretty deep feelings of belonging. So examples are the families that we're a part of or the close friends that we have all serve as primary groups. I like to use these 4 markers to distinguish the main differences between primary and secondary groups, although sometimes there's overlap or a little bit blurring of the lines. So the first one is the length of time. Typically, we're in primary groups for longer periods of time. So think about your family. How long have you been part of your family? How long do you expect to be part of your family? You've probably been part of it your entire life and plan to be a part of it for the rest of your life. That's a really long period of time. The activities we do with our primary groups tend to be very broad in scope, everything from eating dinner together to going to the movies together, going hikes together, getting arguments together, lots of different things we might do with our families. The purpose of interacting with primary groups tends to be just that: to spend time with them, to enjoy them. And then the number of people in our primary groups tends to be smaller, particularly when we're comparing it to secondary groups. Secondary groups, on the other hand, are groups like sports teams that we're on, coworkers that we have, or students in our sociology class, all considered to be secondary groups. And again, when we look at length of time, we tend to be part of these groups for shorter periods of time, typically a finite period of time. So you are teammates for as long as you are on that team, your coworkers for as long as you are employed for the same company, and your classmates for as long as the class lasts. The activities that are engaged upon in secondary groups are very specific and limited in scope and directly connected to the purpose of the group. So the purpose of secondary groups is oftentimes to complete a task or accomplish a goal. So the activities engaged in are going to relate to that task or goal that is the main purpose of interacting in that group. And lastly, the number of secondary groups can be very, very large, right? You are all part of the group of PVCC students, and there are thousands of students at Piedmont, Virginia Community College. Now, sometimes secondary groups can actually turn into a primary group. They can give way to the creation of a primary group. So here we've got a few examples: Gwen Stefani and Blake Shelton. They started as secondary group members, both working together, and eventually became a primary group, an intimate couple. And then we also have Draymond Green and Steph Curry, started as a secondary group, teammates, and now are very good friends. So I imagine that you have a lot of friends in your life that you perhaps met through your interaction first in a secondary group, and that friendship has kind of bought into you in a way that you now are primary group members. Or maybe you were or are on a sports team, but a few of those team members are some of your best friends, right? That's another example of how the secondary group gave way to a primary group. Social networks are very important. Our social networks are the web of direct and indirect ties that connect us to other people, and we are connected to tons of people through our direct and indirect ties. So not just the people that we know, but the people who the people that we know, right? Like, so our friends, but our friends of friends as well. And this, especially with modern technology, means that people are connected more closely than ever. It's actually Stanley Milgram, who we'll talk about a little bit later, was one of the pioneers behind studying or starting kind of research and experiments on social networks. Some of you might be familiar with that VH1 special, The 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. But this idea that people are connected through 6 degrees actually came from Milgram. He had these envelopes that he gave to people in Kansas with names of individuals living in Boston. And he said, here, this is an envelope. This is a person who lives in Boston. I want you to get this envelope to that person. And then he counted how many hands the envelope was exchanged through before it got to that person. Now, this study was done kind of in the middle of the 20th century, before you could just Google a person and look up their address online. So from that, he came up with this idea that people are connected through 6 degrees of separation. Another important concept we get from our social network is Granovetter's theory of social capital, and particularly the strength of weak ties. So social capital refers to the opportunities that we get, or the advantages that we get, from knowing people in privileged positions. So have you ever heard the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know? That phrase is getting at this concept of social capital, right? And it's very important, and it's very true. Despite that all your life you've been told, go to school, study hard, get good grades, that'll get you opportunities. And I'm not denying that, but also get to know people in important positions, because most likely that will also have a very large influence on future opportunities. Now, as your book discusses, social capital is not distributed equally, that we see people in higher social class positions, men and whites, all have greater access and opportunities for social capital. But nonetheless, the people that we know, oftentimes who are connected to through weak ties, they might be more of acquaintances than best friends, have access to information and opportunities that we don't, or people in our close networks don't have. So capitalize on those people that you don't know very well. Maintain relationships with acquaintances, because you never know when they might come in handy. Group dynamics involve the ways that groups form and fall apart, but also the way that groups influence their members. Now, one person that was very interested in this idea of groups and group dynamics was a man named George Simmel. George Simmel was particularly interested in the difference between dyads and triads. So when we look at dyads and triads, we see that a dyad consists of a group of 2 people, whereas a triad consists of a group of 3 people. Now, Simmel thought that when groups changed from 2 people to 3 people, there was a radical and fundamental shift that took place, influencing both the stability group as well as the intensity of the group. He thought that as groups increased in size, they gained stability. However, what they compromised was the intensity of relationships. And I always tell my students, to think about being in a relationship with one person, which is a typical standard in the United States, reinforced by this formal norm that you can only be married to one person at one time. So think about going from a relationship with just one person to a relationship with 2 people, and how you might not be able to share yourself as much in a relationship with 2 other people rather than just a relationship with one people, and all the problems that might arise because of that. Now, why is there more stability in a triad than a dyad? Your book does a pretty good job explaining that, adding a third person means that if somebody leaves the group still stands. It just becomes a dyad. But it also adds in one more person to kind of serve as a moderator to reduce conflicts or bring about peace and cooperation within the group. As we see groups expand even further with more members beyond the triad, we see an increase in stability with a decrease in the intensity of relationships, the closeness or intimacy that we see between members. Another way we can look at group dynamics is through in-groups and out-groups. So as many of you know, if you've read a little bit about me on Blackboard, I went to UNC Chapel Hill, go Heels. I'm from North Carolina, just recently a Virginia resident, but very much love my North Carolina Tar Heels ever since I was a little girl, and have a very strong affection for the Tar Heels. So I'm sorry, UVA fans. I know I'm in hostile territory here, but an in-group is a group that we feel a sense of loyalty towards and that we identify with. However, out-groups, and you see my out group here, are ones that we feel a sense of opposition towards, or rivalry towards, or even hostility towards. And Durkheim thought that in-groups were actually really good. They were good in terms of creating bonds and solidarity, cohesion in society, this close sense of identity and loyalty that we get from in-groups. However, there are a lot of problems that result with out-groups. We see this play out in other ways rather than just college basketball. More recently, we've seen this play out in politics, and, with the election coming up next week, I'm sure if you look at any propaganda, it's going to talk about groups positively that the candidate associates with, and other groups negatively that the candidate does not associate with. This all goes back to in-groups and out-groups. A lot of conflict that we see in society today can also be closely connected to in-groups and out-groups. Another concept, drawing from chapter 3, that we can connect to in-groups and out-groups is oftentimes ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. This idea that in-groups are better than out-groups, and that if we can harness this ability to look at society in a culturally relativistic way, perhaps we can decrease some of the tensions that result from in-groups and out-groups. So while, again, in-groups can certainly strengthen bonds between individuals, the dynamics between in-groups and out-groups lead to conflict. Now, reference groups are groups that provide a standard of comparison, right? With reference groups, we tend to form a subjective sense of our well-being by examining ourselves relative to others. So one person that did research back in the 1940s originally on reference groups was a man by the name Stouffer. And Stouffer was very interested in soldiers' perceptions about their chances for promotion. And so he looked at soldiers in two different units. One unit where there was high rates of promotion, and another unit where there was low rates of promotion, and compared kind of how the soldiers felt about themselves in these two different groups. And interestingly enough, he found that soldiers tend to have a more positive view of themselves and their chances for promotion when they saw less promotion, because what they did see was many people around them in the same position. Therefore, they didn't feel deprived. They didn't feel that they weren't accessing something that others were, because not many people were getting promoted. However, in units where there were high rates of promotions, soldiers tended to feel a little more negatively about themselves and their chances of promotion. They were comparing themselves to others around them, saw others getting promoted and themselves not. Therefore, did feel that sense of deprivation. You guys all do this oftentimes after an exam. You'll ask around, hey, what'd you do? What'd you do? How'd you do? What'd you get on that test? Or what'd you get on that assignment? And essentially what you're doing is utilizing your classmates as a reference group, right? You are going to come up with a subjective sense of self and well-being from the way that the rest of the class did. If you, for example, got a 75 on an assignment, but after asking around found that most people scored in the 50s and 60s, you're going to feel pretty good about yourself. But if you got a 75 on an assignment and found out most people were getting 95s and 100s, your feelings about that grade are going to be quite different. Brooke also talks about we can be part of reference groups that we are not actually part of, or we can utilize reference groups to influence ourselves that we're not actually a part of. So, with unlimited amount of access to media and technology, oftentimes we see people in positions that we would like to be in, and there again, use them as a standard of comparison and form a subjective sense of well-being and self based upon this. Because of the very, very thin bodies of models, we've seen many women and also men subject themselves to anorexia and bulimia to fit this model in society, this ideal in society, right? Utilizing this group as a reference group. Now, another group dynamic is group cohesion. Cohesion is very important for groups. If there was no cohesion, then we would see that groups would dismantle, right? That perhaps anomie would result. There wouldn't be this bond connecting people together. So group cohesion is very important, right? And the amount of cohesion that you'll find in a group depends on the shared values of the people in the group, the similar demographic traits of the people in the group, and also the attraction to a group. So those things can also all affect the cohesion of a group. But can there be too much cohesion? And the answer to that is yes. So Irving Janis, a sociologist, came up with this term, groupthink. And groupthink refers to the tendency to enforce a high degree of conformity, which creates demand for unanimous agreement. This idea that people are so committed to the group that they conform to other people's ideas, perhaps rejecting their own ideas even, to not compromise their position within the group. So I really like this cartoon. I think it visually demonstrates groupthink, this idea that we have everybody agreeing, but thinking, maybe that's not the best idea ever. And unfortunately, we have quite a few examples of groupthink in history. One of the most notable is the decision to go to war with Iraq over weapons of mass destruction. After this decision was made, there were many people in Congress who said that they didn't actually agree with the decision that they made. But when asked why they made this decision, it's because they didn't want to seem as unpatriotic, particularly following September 11th. So here we see groupthink at work. Too much cohesion to the group, too much commitment to patriotism in the American public, leading people to kind of compromise their own ideas and conform to the group. Group dynamics also include social influence. Groups can have considerable social influence over their individual members. So your book talks about two very historical and notable experiments demonstrating this. The first one was conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1940s. And so Asch was looking at the power that groups have over individuals, particularly in getting individuals to compromise their own judgment and go along with the group. I've added in your reflection journal an opportunity to watch some footage from the Asch experiment. And it really is quite fascinating the reactions we see from individuals as they willingly or sometimes begrudgingly compromise their own judgment just so that they can be considered a part of a group or don't go against the group. And then Stanley Milgram's experiment, famous and also considered to be quite unethical today, that examines whether or not people would administer a deathly amount of shock to another individual just because a seemingly legitimate person told them to do so. What I find fascinating about his research was that way more people administered that lethal amount of shock than he originally predicted. Originally, he predicted it was about 10%, and it turned out to be about 60%. There was a British show back in 2006, I believe, that attempted to repeat Milgram's research. How they were able to do this, I'm not really sure. But they found about the same results, that about 60% of people, more than half of people, would harm someone, right? Harm someone in a deadly way just because a legitimate source of authority or seemingly legitimate source of authority is telling them to do so. Now, we look at conformity, we see that there's a couple of different reasons why people are willing to go along with the group. One is referred to as compliance, that people go along with a group either to get some sort of reward for going along with the group or to avoid some sort of punishment, right? So they want to seek those positive sanctions and avoid the negative sanctions. However, sometimes people go along with the group because they believe that the group is correct and they adopt the beliefs of the group. And we call this internalization. And if and when you watch that Asch experiment, you see examples of both of these. And some cases in the Asch experiment, people know that the group is wrong, but they go along with the group because they don't want to get any dirty looks that the group is going to give them. But in other cases, we see some people go along with the group because they think, oh, well, maybe the group knows something that I don't know, and therefore they must be right and I must be wrong, right? And so think about yourself and, some groups that you go along with. Perhaps it's because you want to kind of fit in and get that positive reward, or at least avoid that negative sanction, or perhaps you go along with the group because you have adopted the beliefs of the group. The last thing I want to discuss is this concept of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy being a formal organization that was analyzed by Weber as a very rationalized form of group in society. So as Weber's analyzing the social world, he's looking at how society is becoming more and more rationalized. And he identifies bureaucracy as one of the most rationalized forms of organizations in society. And I'm going to talk about some characteristics of bureaucracy. These overlap a little bit with Weber's ideal type. So when you're going back to conduct your discussion board, please refer to these as well as the ideal type. It's not that one is better than the other. I just like these characteristics. I think they're a little bit easier to understand in terms of kind of how Weber classified bureaucracies. So he looked at the different characteristics of bureaucracies and found that most bureaucracies had these 6 different characteristics. One is specialization. And so what that means is that there are specialized tasks that each person in a bureaucracy does. So for example, I'm going to use restaurants. Whether you've worked in a restaurant or been a customer at a restaurant, you're probably familiar with the way that restaurants work. So when we look at restaurants, we see people perform specialized tasks. You have servers that wait on people, you have hosts that seat people, you have cooks that cook the food, you have managers that kind of keep everyone in line and do the scheduling. You have people that bus the tables, people that wash the dishes. So everyone's doing a specialized task. Very rarely do you go into a restaurant and see someone doing all of those tasks. And if you do find that, oftentimes it's a very, very small restaurant. In addition to specialization, we see technical competence. And what this refers to is people have special trainings and skills to complete the task that they're engaging in. So almost any job in the United States today requires some sort of training. If you are hired to work in a restaurant, oftentimes you have to go through a period of training where you learn how to do the job, perhaps take some sort of test and are deemed to be technically competent to engage in the organization. For example, my job here at PVCC, it was required that I had a master's degree in sociology and at least 18 hours of graduate coursework in the field. Hierarchy of offices, that there is supervision at the top of those below them, right? That we've got those large corporate owners at the top. Below, we might have some middle managers, and then below them, kind of the general base. And there may or may not be different layers in between. Next, rules and regulations. One of the most important characteristics of bureaucracy. They're what is responsible for making the bureaucracy efficient, making the bureaucracy predictable. People are aware of the rules and regulations, understand how they work, right? So within a bureaucracy like a restaurant, you might see that there are rules and regulations for when you need to be at work and when the restaurant opens, and what the standard procedures should be for seating people, or for taking orders, or for submitting orders to the kitchen, or for cooking the food, right? The bureaucracy can operate efficiently and predictably as long as it follows these rules and regulations. Along with rules and regulations, we have impersonality. That means the rules and regulations come before the people. It doesn't matter how hungry you are as a customer. If it is 2:30 and the restaurant doesn't open until 5 o'clock, they are not going to take into consideration how hungry you are and open specifically for you. That would be inefficient. That would be an inefficient use of time and resources to pay people when they don't have to pay people, to use energy when they don't have to use energy, right? And so it's less about you as an individual, more about the efficiency of the bureaucracy. And if they took into consideration each individual, then the bureaucracy wouldn't operate efficiently. If you think about the classroom, if I gave an exam only when all my students were healthy, when all my students had studied adequately, when all my students got enough rest the night before, I might not ever give an exam in sociology, because who's to say that would all line up and that would all happen? In this case, the rules and regulations in my syllabus, when exams are going to be, comes before individuals, how they're feeling, how much sleep they got, how much studying they put in, what their level of health is, because I couldn't operate a classroom efficiently if I took in consideration the individual wishes and situations of my students. Lastly, formal written communication. This is also pertinent to the efficiency of bureaucracies, particularly in allowing those people at the top of the hierarchy to communicate with those below. Now, while Weber thought that bureaucracies were the most formalized example of organization in society, he was not without criticism of bureaucracies and thought that there certainly were problems of bureaucracies. One is red tape. Red tape refers to this idea that the rules and the regulations can sometimes contribute to inefficiency. So if you have ever been at the DMV, you probably have experienced this. A girlfriend of mine was there with two of her children, her parents who live outside of the United States, and she was with her father who was renewing his license at the DMV. They waited for 4 hours for what was a 10-minute appointment. And if you've ever spent any time with the DMV, you probably know what I mean. It was quite inefficient for them to sit there for 4 hours and wait for a 10-minute transaction, but they were engaging in the process and the procedures that the rules and the regulations at the DMV dictate. Another concern is this iron law of oligarchy, that bureaucracies lend themselves to oligarchy, the rule of many by a few. And then lastly, Weber was very concerned about this concept of dehumanization, this idea that we're so focused on getting from point A to point B that we kind of lose the meaning and perhaps a little bit of ourselves as we go from point A to point B. So have you ever called a helpline and talked to an automated kind of computerized voice rather than an individual person? And there's not a lot of leeway for explanations or understandings or conversations when you're faced with a computerized voice. However, it's efficient, right? So we are reduced to interacting with a computer rather than an individual. So Weber was aware of these problems, but nonetheless still intrigued by the rationalization of bureaucracies and the promise and the efficiency that bureaucracies could provide for society. I also really like this Dilbert cartoon below, highlighting the inefficiency of the rationalization within bureaucracies. Ritzer was also quite critical of bureaucracies and kind of termed his criticism the McDonaldization of society. So George Ritzer looked at this institution of McDonald's and noted these 4 principles applied to McDonald's were being expanded throughout not only the United States, but the world as well. Efficiency, calculability, uniformity, and control through automation. So this idea that these bureaucracies were being run efficient in a way that was calculable, in a way that was uniform and predictable, and that was controlled through automation allowed them to serve hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, allowed the customers to know what the expectations are, allowed for great amounts of profitability. But in this, he was quite critical of this rationalization in society and was concerned that this rationality actually lent itself to irrationality. So some of my favorite examples would be the self-flushing toilet, right? The self-flushing toilet is pretty rational. It keeps the toilet clean. It keeps plumbing problems from occurring. It keeps the person who is responsible for cleaning the toilets to spend less time cleaning. Therefore, you might not have to pay them for as long. Quite rational. However, if any of you have ever used a self-flushing toilet, you've probably found that it's wasted quite a bit of water flushing 3 or 4 times before you've even finished going to the bathroom. So an example of the irrationality of rationality. Another thing is food. Almost all of our food today is processed in a bureaucratic process, and it makes things really convenient. We can get cheap food that all you have to do essentially is microwave it and it will be ready to eat. But we're losing our connection to the land. We're losing our connection to heritage as we don't rely on recipes as much passed down from generation to generation. And I use pasta here because I'm Italian. I come from a lineage where my great-grandparents immigrated to the United States and brought lots of their Italian recipes, one of that being pasta sauce. My entire life, I only had homemade pasta sauce, but in my adult life have yet to make it even once. And then there's the great self-checkout machine. So maybe you were walking through the grocery store and decided you were a little thirsty and opened up a bottle of water or bottle of soda and took a few sips. Saw that the lines were quite long at the cashiers, plus you didn't really feel like talking to anybody, so you went to the self-checkout machine. But when you scan that bottle of water, bottle whatever you have, and put it in the bag, the machine keeps talking to you over and over and telling you to put your item in the bag, because it doesn't register the proper weight because you took some sips out of it. And you've got to call somebody over and they've got to fix the machine and you've got to explain what happened. So it doesn't turn out to be a very efficient process at all. Weber was concerned about the homogenization of cultures, particularly in a global context, as well as dehumanization, when we see these principles of McDonald's being applied to other industries and circumstances throughout society and throughout the world. So how have companies tried to respond to some of these bureaucratic constraints? One company that I want you to examine and analyze a little bit is Zappos, that is changing its corporate structure from a hierarchy to more of a holacracy, trying to take out that hierarchy of offices, allowing people to connect and collaborate in perhaps a more efficient way, and also perhaps in a way that empowers them and allows them to be creative, right? The chapter focuses on how creativity can sometimes be lost when people are trapped in this hierarchical, rigid, formal organization of a bureaucracy. So the question then becomes, how can people and corporations and governments even benefit from bureaucracies without being controlled by them? How can we allow for creativity? How can we allow for increased democracy? How can we allow for an increased sense of self and participation within bureaucracies that allow us to be efficient, but allow us to be humans at the same time? So I hope you enjoy analyzing yourself as part of the social world, as you interact with groups, as you interact with bureaucracies, and as you try to mitigate even your self-identity as more of a group person or an individualistic person this week.